So now we're going to continue talking about Russian regions, but now we will jump to the liabilities side of the story from the assets side. So we're going to talk about the Russian depositors. This is the joint project with Andrey Zubanov from Wisconsin, Madison, and with Koen Schoors, who will help me if I miss something important, I hope. So the idea of this study comes, first of all, from the importance of the market discipline in the Russian market for the personal deposits. Very basically, just to remind you, the market discipline implies that the depositors somehow react to the changes in the bank riskiness. So they change the characteristics of their fund supply in response to increased risks of their banks. There are three basic mechanisms which are usually studied in the empirical literature. Disciplining by price means that riskier banks have to offer higher deposit rates. Disciplining by quantity means that the banks which are more risky suffer from some drop in the deposits or deposit growth rates. And finally, disciplining by maturity shifts implies that the depositors in risky institutions prefer to switch from more risky long-term deposits to less risky short-term ones or even non-call ones. There are numerous empirical papers providing some evidence for the market discipline existence in different countries and in different markets. There are lots of them dealing with the Russian markets, including the market for personal deposits. Here I don't focus on this massive literature. You can see quite a broad literature review in the paper of 2013. What I should stress here is that the same empirical literature provides a great list of different factors or events which in fact undermine this market disciplining. First of all, during the crisis, the depositors, especially the retail depositors, become less sensitive to the financial information because they react to some macro information or something like that. Then when the banks are introduced into the deposit insurance system, of course, any incentives to monitor the banks are at least reduced or even disappear. And the deposit insurance system is sort of explicit guarantee for the depositors. There may exist also kind of implicit guarantees for very special groups of banks. There is empirical evidence that the state banks and foreign banks are usually disciplined to a lower degree at least, because the depositor considers these banks to be safer because the owners or the beneficiaries of such kind of banks will care about the banks in case of any financial difficulties. What is true about the Russian market for retail deposit? The truth is that this market, as I guess any retail banking market in Russia, faces not the federal competition, the competition on federal level, but the regional level ones. So all the competition goes down from the federal level to the level of the regions. So the market is really regionally segmented. This means that another important source of the implicit guarantees may appear from the side of the regional government, regional authorities, not only from the federal level ones. So we can expect these guys to provide the implicit guarantees to the depositors as well. So these regional ties should somehow matter for the retail depositors as well. The only tricky thing here is that the depositors should somehow suspect that the regional ties exist. You know, the retail depositors are somehow unsophisticated. And in the same time, they are very sensitive to the information provided to them directly. They are very sensitive to things that they can directly see. There is a long list of evidence facts for that. For example, if you remember the recent crisis of 2008, there were virtually no bank runs in 2008, at least in the middle of 2008, because no one knows that the banks suffer from many financial difficulties because the mass media told us that everything is okay, Russia is a safe haven, the banks are the most stable banks in the world, so on and so forth. This is the information provided directly, right? Another, I guess, good example comes from 2009. We conducted this survey of Russian banks Moscow banks depositors, and we have noticed a strange thing. We have several foreign banks in our sample, but surprisingly, if a bank doesn't have the foreign name, the depositors do not consider it to be a foreign one. Yeah? To know whether these type of things exist, we need something which can measure these regional ties very explicitly for the unsophisticated depositors. So in this paper, we try to find out whether these regional ties, at least as considered by the depositors, indeed undermine the market discipline for the period of 2001-2010, including the financial crisis. And to give you the brief answer, we say yes, indeed, it undermines, especially during the period of financial instability, but surprisingly not because of the trust to the local authorities. So, to give you some more details on that. In this study, we actually check for 4 hypotheses. First of all, we expect, of course, the existence of the implicit guarantees provided by the regional ties. Then we expect these regional ties work to the highest extent in the regions where the population trusts to the local authorities and can rely on them. Then we think about the financial crisis, and as the empirical literature suggests, during the financial crisis, these implicit guarantees should play even more important roles. So we expect these ties to be even more strong in providing the implicit guarantees. And the highest level of this reduction, so to say, of the market discipline, we should observe in the regions where the trust of the local to the local authorities is the highest. So, how to measure these regional ties? To make it simpler for the depositors to understand that, at least to suppose that there exists any of them, we propose a very, very direct measure, very, very simple measure, that the bank's name. This is the first thing that the depositor sees. So we consider a bank to be regionally tied if the name of the bank includes the region name, the city or town name, or some local landmark. We also introduce a broader definition of the regional ties, at least to check that our results are more or less stable. And this broader definition also includes the banks with some broader landmarks in their names, some broader geographical areas, then the word region in the name, or maybe some other less explicit signals. Again, the tiny problem here is that during quite a long period of time, the banks do change their names. What's the most important for us is that the banks may jump from the regionally tied group to non-regionally tied and vice versa. And approximately 10% of the Russian banks did change their name in this or that way. A very good example here is Petrovsky Bank. Before 2002, it was named like Petrovsky Narodny Bank, which is regionally tied according to our broad definition. Then for another 4 years, it was called MDM Bank St. Petersburg, which is evidently regionally tied according to our basic definition. Then, before August 2009, it was VEF Bank, so no regional ties at all. And finally, since August 2009, it is Petrovsky Bank, the current type. So, as you can see, it happens sometimes that it may really happen quite frequently during the period of time we consider here. I guess I can skip this. So what we do in terms of the regressions here, we use quite traditional way to measure the market discipline. So on the left-hand side of the regressions, we have the proxies for quantitative and price disciplining. So we have deposit interest rates for disciplining by price, and two variables for quantitative disciplining, namely the deposit growth rates and regional market share. On the left-hand side, first of all, we have the number of bank fundamentals which measure the bank's riskiness. The sensitivity to these bank fundamentals will signal us that the market discipline exists. We have, again, quite traditional set of these variables. We introduce the capital adequacy, which is capital over assets, then liquidity ratio, which is liquidity over assets, then the share of non-performing loans, and the size of the bank, which is measured by the natural logarithm of the total assets. Then to catch these regionally tied effects, we introduce the interaction, where R is the binary variable equal to 1 for those banks who are regionally tied. And finally, to check whether these regional effects work better in the regions with a high level of trust to local authorities, we introduce this multiplied variable, where G is the share of population supporting the local authorities. Yeah.
So the control group is basically federal banks, or is it also regional banks that just you don't identify as such in the name?
The second option, yeah. So we look at the regional banks in the eyes of the depositors, yeah. We also control for the bank's participation in the deposit insurance, and we also have time and region dams here, fixed effects. Yes, this basic model is estimated on the shorter sample from 2001 to 2007, so we don't introduce the crisis here. We do introduce it here. To check for the crisis effects, we use the longer sample. As you can see, it covers 2008-2009, which are the crisis years. And here, the regression is a bit longer. So first of all, we check whether the deposit insurers as a whole for all the banks is undermined by the crisis. Then to check whether the regional effects change because of the crisis, we introduce this crisis variable here. And our final, what's that? Our final hypothesis dealing with the regions with different levels of trust are covered by this very long variable, where we have this G, the share of population trusting to the government, and the crisis timing. So just to give you some technical details, we withdraw Moscow from our sample because Moscow banks are, of course, not regional, at least in terms of the share of, in terms of the regional market share, because there is no regional market share for the Moscow banks. There are many offices in virtually all Russian regions, if we consider Sberbank, for example. Then to remove the influence of the outliers, we use the 1% venzorization from both tails of the sample. And finally, we used random effects estimation because our sample, of course, is not very stable during the study time. Once again, I guess I can also skip it, but here I list the hypothesis we test and list the variables in the regressions responsible for this or that hypothesis. The data. To collect, to construct the regionally tied banks variable, we simply traced all the list of the Russian banks, and we were marking those banks who are regionally tied. So that's quite simple. That's long work, but still simple. The problem was with the changes of names. So we used these two data sets. These are not data sets, but sort of catalogs of bank histories. There you can find, I guess, the files for most of the banks in the Russian Federation, containing their history over time. So here we traced how the banks changed their names over time. Then for bank fundamentals, we used Mobile database, which is based on the bank financial statements. And if this data is not enough, we use directly the bank financial statements, which are published by the Central Bank of Russia at their web page. And finally, the variable, which is a proxy for the trust to the local authorities, is constructed using the results of the courier surveys by two largest sociological companies in Russia. The data is quite good. It's urban multi-state stratified random sample. And from these surveys, we use the one question which can help us. This is the question of here it is basically, generally speaking, do you hold or not with the actions of the head of your region, or republic president if you take any republic, or the mayor if we take Moscow. Again, this data is not a panel one, so we had to look through all the surveys looking for the particular question in the results. So it is also manually collected. And here are the results. This is just to show you that we do have these huge, long tables. Of course, I will show you the most interesting effects there. So first of all, in line with the existing empirical literature, we provide the evidence of the market discipline existence for this market. So this is for all banks, and this is what we expect to be there according to the results the other authors get in their papers. So more risky banks have to offer high interest rates. They do not enjoy high deposit growth rates or regional market share. So everything is okay if we look at the basic regression. And what's about the regional ties? First of all, the regionally tied banks, indeed, as we expected, enjoy lower interest rates, but in the same time, somehow they do not enjoy a higher growth rate. That's surprising. Then we provide some evidence that the regional ties indeed undermine the market discipline, at least if we look at the growth rates and the liquidity and the bank size. But this evidence is not very convincing for us, because in the same time we see this thing. We see that in terms of capital adequacy for the deposit growth or the bank size in terms of the market share, the market discipline is somehow enhanced for the regionally tied banks. So that's surprising. And we wonder where it comes from. And it comes from, even more surprisingly, the regions where the share of the population supporting the local authorities is higher. So it is a very great contrast to our hypothesis. We hypothesized just the opposite. So in the regions where the population should rely on the local governments and then get relaxed in terms of their banks, the opposite happens. So these were the results for the stable times. Here comes the set of the results for the crisis times. Here you can see in light green, I guess you have this difference, but nevertheless, in light green we have the stable things, which doesn't change during the crisis. In dark green we have some signs of the enhancement of the market discipline, and in orange, as you can see, that's most of the results are in orange here. We see the evidence that, again, in line with the existing literature, the market discipline is significantly undermined for all the banks during the periods of the financial instability. That's good. That's good that we are just continuing the existing empirical results. So what happens in the group of the regionally tied banks? Happily and quite stably, along with the different modifications of the model, we provide the evidence that in the group of the regionally tied banks, the market discipline during the crisis period of time is reduced even more compared to all the other banks. So this is what we expect it to be, and this happens for both disciplining by quantity, which is measured by the deposit growth, and disciplining by price, which is measured by the interest rate. But of course, we can't cope without the surprises. If we again try to look at the regions with high levels of the support to the local authorities, with high levels of trust to local authorities, we again see some enhancement of the market discipline, which is even higher during the crisis times. So this is the signal for us that the mechanism we are studying is indeed there, but it works in some other way. We performed a couple of robustness checks here to check whether the results are stable. First of all, as I've already mentioned, we check whether the broader definition of the regional ties is working. Yes, indeed. And some of the results are even more pronounced or are even more stable across the modifications. Then we looked at even fewer regions. So we threw away Moscow, then Leningradsk Oblast and Moscow Oblast. And we obtained virtually the same results. And finally, we tried to replace some bank fundamentals to more sophisticated ones. Namely, we replaced the capital adequacy to capital over the risk-weighted assets, which is N1. And then we replaced the liquidity with N3, which is the liquidity for 30 days. That's the CBR ratios, actually. These are more complicated for the depositors, but in the same time, they may measure riskiness better, at least according to the banks and regulators. But the depositors are more important here, so our results seem to be less stable for these modifications. So, to conclude what we get here so far, first of all, we provide again some evidence for the market discipline existing. That's good. And the local authorities indeed are seen, at least to some small degree, as the guarantors for the bank stability, which of course undermines the market discipline. The exceptions are the capital adequacy for deposit growth and bank size for the market share. And these exceptions are the most evident in the regions which surprisingly support the local government for the highest levels. The financial crisis, as we expected, undermined the market discipline. Both deposit growth changed the sensitivity and partially the price, namely the interest rates. And the regional ties, which provided a bit of support here, provide even more support here, more evidently. I mean the support in the case of the market discipline deterioration. And again, the regionally tied banks are even more intensively disciplined during the financial crisis in the regions with high levels of trust to the local authority. That's something surprising really for us. So, thinking about all these surprises, we understand now that regional ties indeed undermine the market discipline, especially during the crisis, but it is not due to the reliance to the local authorities. So now we wonder what's the story behind them. Yeah, thank you. So trying to explain these enhanced market discipline in the regions with the high trust to the local authorities, we are thinking of two things. First of all, maybe those who trust to the local authorities in the same time do not trust to the banks as a whole and the financial markets as a whole. So this distrust to all of the finance of the world results into higher sensitivity to bank risks. Another story is that trust to the local authority may result from the distrust to the federal authorities, which in turn are considered to be responsible for the banks. And finally, maybe there are some other motives behind the regional ties, not the ties to the regional authorities, but the ties to something else. So here we are going to check the significance of some geographical difference, some ethno-linguistic fractionalization, some other variables may be introduced to catch this difference in the regional development, and so on and so forth. So I guess, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. I'll welcome the comments. Thank you. Thank you very much, Moshe. The discussion will be by Professor John Bonin. I'm doing several things at the same time.
This I can put in my pocket.
Yes.
That go here, or does it have to go closer? Okay. Why do I feel like you're putting a boutonniere in my... Thank you. Now, I also will show you my...
You can use the clicker.
Can I make this go forward and backwards, or what?
Forward and
backwards. Excellent. Okay. Good morning. I will save my thanks to my next presentation because I don't want to take up too much time before the coffee break. But I do want to say thank you to Masha and her co-authors for providing me with an earlier version of this paper, which allowed me to prepare these slides, which I normally don't do as a discussant. So this was very, very helpful. I did read the revised version that Masha presented to you this morning. So some of my comments on the slides no longer apply, and I will tell you which ones as we go through. Firstly, as you heard, this is a paper about a research question of whether or not implicit guarantees by local government authorities generate less market discipline for depositors. And in that sense, it's in the general genre of work that looks at the influence and relatedness of lending, but on the deposit side. So I think what was really striking for me, firstly, was how careful the authors were about distinguishing ownership from what depositors would perceive as regional or local influence. And I think that's a very important part of this paper and something I haven't seen in other papers. So I think this is very, very good. They look at the impact of the relationship and whether or not it depends. I'm sorry, that's supposed to be public trust. Oh, it is public trust. I corrected it, not in these things that I printed out. The influence of market discipline, whether it depends on public trust of the local authorities. Now, there's a subplot in all that, and this is what happens during the great financial crisis, okay? Or the global financial crisis, depending on how you want to use the G term in that abbreviation. I think for me, at least, all over the world, this was a story about a flight to safety, and I think this is an important element of the story that is probably not stressed enough in the paper to date, and I'll come back to that. We expect that influence should be more important during the global financial crisis, precisely because of this rush to safety. Now, is it no longer dependent on public trust or not? I think that this confluence of whether or not now the macro environment is so turbulent that it's hard to pick out little other signals is a very important thing to probe, but I think it's important also to keep in mind what's going on. The data set is quarterly data from 2000 to 2010, approximately 700 banks, except when they use the trust variable, and then the number of banks decreased substantially. You heard the measures of market discipline. I won't go over that. The benchmark model uses the period before the global financial crisis. Estimation, you heard that, don't have to go over that. And now the results, I'll go very quickly through this too because Marcia gave a very good presentation and some of these results don't apply anymore. But the first one is that they do find the existence of market discipline by correlates of the bank fundamentals with the market discipline measures. They're significant, correct sign. They have some evidence that banks have having regional ties experience less market discipline, but only in regions with low public trust. And this is the major mystery of these results, why. Public trust influences market discipline only indirectly. I think that result still holds in this version of the paper, but I'm less confident of that statement now. But that the global financial crisis really does change things. And it changes things in a way some are expected and some are not. So I'd like to proceed with my suggestions because that's what a discussant's supposed to do. My first suggestion in general bullet holds. I think before you actually go much more forward with the paper, you really need a more parsimonious specification, just so the results become transparent. It's certainly, I applaud those big tables with all the results, but they're really, really hard to read and hard to interpret. So this first one has gone away. In the version I saw, they had a strange interactive term that I didn't understand. So forget this. This is also not, I think, applicable anymore. But this, I just think that you really want to focus on the story you're telling, and therefore I think you do need a more parsimonious specification. I think that the global financial crisis interpretation is important, and in this version of the paper that you heard, it comes out in a much more dramatic way than it did in the version I first read. So I think that when you look at the impact of the global financial crisis, the direct effect was a decrease in market share, and there was a kind of weak effect on the price signal, but nothing on deposit growth. But there are indirect effects. In the version of the paper I read, there were no clear patterns to these interactive coefficients. I think there are some clearer patterns now in the next version, but I would certainly focus on those. And I wonder whether or not you have enough data to just do separate regressions. It was a little confusing to me to have the benchmark period before the global financial crisis and then a full sample that included that and now this next period. So, you know, I don't know. It might just for robustness. One of the robustness things you could do is split it up that way, because I think you have enough data to do that. You alluded to deposit insurance in the presentation, but in the paper I read, and I think in this one, unless I was asleep on the plane when I was reading it, I don't think you really focus enough on the role of deposit insurance. You know, we would expect that the impact of deposit insurance would be bigger during the crisis period. Now, the impact during the non-crisis period, that first part of the sample, the coefficients were relatively unstable and sometimes even perverse. The lower deposit growth perversion is retained in the new version. The higher deposit rate is not, but the higher deposit rate is maintained in the full sample. So I'm a little confused about how you interpret deposit insurance. And it's clearly a situation where we would expect some relationship between deposit insurance and market share during the crisis period. I'm wondering if including an interactive term with the crisis dummy would help to interpret some of that. Koen has seen this comment from me every time I comment on his papers. Where's Sparbank? Where's Sberbank? I understand it's a Moscow-based bank. I'm not that non-conversant in Russian banking. But here's the thing. If you look at the data, the mean market share for these banks that are included in the sample is very low. Extremely low. The coefficient of variation is 4.5, and that's a lot of variability in there in that market share. And if during the global financial crisis we expect a flight to safety, isn't Sberbank where you would expect the depositors to go for safety? So again, I'm not an expert on Russian banking. You all in this room know way more about Russian banking than I know, but it seems to me that there's an elephant in the room that's missing. And I wonder if I'm wrong, just tell me, but that's one thing I should do. I got a bunch of picky points that I can probably just go over with Masha and Koen later on. Maybe the most, this one is probably not correct because they're so very careful. I want to applaud how carefully you've put together this data set. This was not easy. 1 minute, okay. I have to be very short. This was not easy to put together, and I think that was a very important part of the paper. As a former editor, I'm really picky about these things, and this is very, very well done. This one is the one I'd like you to think about. I mean, why do we lose so many banks when you introduce the trust variable? Because it's a regional variable. And so, I don't know. Okay. And then, you know, I think you got to worry a little bit about some double counting with fixed effects and things. And okay, R squared's a low. Okay, conclusion. There's a lot to like in this paper. Investigating implicit guarantees to banks from relationships with regional authorities in a segmented Russian banking sector has general interest. So I think this is a very important paper outside of its application to just Russian banking. And it has required, and as I said, I applaud all the work that was done to create the data set. Now, if you again look at the data, only approximately 17% of the observations have a regional affiliation of R, which is the first more specific type of affiliation, and then approximately another 27% are in the broader definition. It seems to me, therefore, that it would be much more useful to use the broader definition in the original rather than in the robustness things, because that's where I think you get much more information. The market share here goes up a bit too, so I think that's important. 0.033 or something, I've forgotten the number, but the market share goes up here too. And then when you consider the impact of the global financial crisis on implicit guarantees, it does require careful interpretation of these cross effects between the G variable is the trust variable, the R variable is a regional variable, and BF, should be an F over there too, are bank fundamentals. I said separate regressions for robustness check, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Proposed to have the same system as last time, so we can collect a few questions and then we'll give much to reply. So are there any questions from the floor? Sorry, there's one question.
Okay. I really like the topic, and I think it's very interesting to explore how regional banks are different in terms of market split. I'm not very familiar with the oil side of how banking system works in Russia, so I was not sure how regional support would be legitimately available for banks to get the support. For federal level, every bank, I believe, has deposit insurance, right?
Yes.
So that's from national perspective of depositor is the main key reason to consider investing, not to invest, to move in the bank or not. So is there any difference in terms of how it can be supported or not, the bank that is regional one?
Maybe we collect everything and then you have no problem.
Okay, besides that, you just, instead of looking at the regional support, you could examine this question as whether there is a more of behavioral or regional presence of the banks and control for the market share of the federal or bigger banks within the region from economic point of view. A couple more things that I wanted to mention, that we measured the discipline with the deposit. It would be probably better to look at the spread relative to the average whatever the person in the market, and also look at the spread between deposit and loan rate to see how much of the efficiency of the market they have there on the bank, and just to capture this variation not only to deposit level but also to how efficient how it's not
But Karsten, you have a question?
Yeah, just two small remarks maybe. So one thing I thought, whether there's any chance to check whether these banks offered additional services, like if people can pay their bills or whatever with that bank, maybe they would be more inclined to use also their other services to have a deposit there. So maybe that could explain something. So which regional banks could offer, no? And another one would be whether you try to combine actually the perception of being a regional bank and the actual ownership. So a regional bank that is called regional bank but actually is also owned by the regional government, that would be maybe even like a stronger signal for people.
Okay, and then there's still a third.
Yes, here? I have actually two remarks as well. I'm concerned about the issue that in regions there are some really powerful banks which hold, we call it the projects for big companies, and they have the salaries in this bank that might influence also your result, if it's possible to control for that. And also the second remark is about the random effects model, because as far as I understand, you imply that these effects are uncorrelated with the exploratory variable that I introduced in your model. So how you can explain that? But because I guess that the features of bank, they should be correlated with the fundamentals that you introduced, as well as the so all the controlled variables that you are in your regression.
As I see no further comments in the room, then
Okay.
please, Masha, you
Yeah, I know.
make sort of
I know
tell them there's something
yeah,
we will
yeah, yeah.
need to leave for the coffee break, but please sort of pick up a few of those.
Okay, actually, thanks a lot for all the comments. Answering Anna's questions, we have usually we have no formal mechanism for these guarantees. That's why we call them implicit guarantees. They are perceived by the depositors. This happens from times to times in a very, in very different manners. So we know that if some difficulties happen, the government will support somehow, we don't know even how. The state banks, the foreign banks may help their subsidiaries, but may not, of course. So here we continue the stories with these implicit guarantees. That's why we at least we started with this story. So now we see that it doesn't work properly. That's why we are now thinking about different mechanisms on that. And I guess, yes, we can. First thing that I think of when you mentioned these additional services is these huge salary projects. So I guess we can look in the financial statements something related to the maybe current accounts or current accounts. So at least try to control for that something. I guess that's it, just to economize the time. Actually, we are 10 minutes late already.
Okay, so let me thank everyone for the first session. Especially thanks go for the presenters, Koen and Masha, and I have no directions for coffee, but I'm quite sure we'll manage it. Let's try to be back here at 12 o'clock as stated.
Thank you guys. The coffee break is